You're listening to Radio VR in Washington. I'm Molly Cedar. A new study recently released shows that persistent gaps are threatening America's economic future. The study is called Beyond Broke, and it says why closing the racial wealth gap is a priority for national economic security. It's released by Duke and the Center for Global Policy Solutions. I have USC law professor Jody Armour joining me to take a look at this study. Jody, thank you so much for joining us. So you took a look at this study, and what stood out to you?
Well, a lot of things. First, that the study's authors are saying we need to tackle this problem of the racial wealth gap, not for reasons of justice or fairness necessarily, the rest of American citizens. We need to tackle this problem because it's in your own self-interest, white America, to do something about this racial wealth gap because it is threatening our economic security going into the future. We're going to have, by 2050, many people are saying, a nation that is predominantly one of color, where people from non-white groups are in the majority and numerically. And if they are lagging far behind economically, as they are now, according to this report, when it comes to black and brown people anyway, if they are lagging far behind, then we will have a nation that will be sputtering and not doing well at all economically in the world market, because we will have a lot of our citizens who can't be productive economic actors. So the report says, don't do it because it's the right thing to do necessarily. That is, do something about the racial wealth gap. Don't do it because it's the moral thing to do. Don't do it out of concern for restitution. Do it out of enlightened self-interest, the rest of America.
Do you think there's a place in the conversation on racial inequality for this kind of piece, a piece of this tone, a realistic approach to what's in our self-interest? Do you think that's an appropriate tone to use?
That seems to be the one that works. It would be nice to say, as part of our narrative of American justice and the increasing dispensation of American justice to American citizens, that Americans do it because of moral suasion, that we do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. But what we actually find is that it takes protest, it takes action on the part of those who feel like they are oppressed, and it takes them wedding their concerns with those of the majority. Derek Bell calls it interest convergence.
This study, it says, among one of the conclusions in the study is that when it comes to the racial gap in liquid wealth, African Americans and Latinos are nearly penniless. Do you want to comment on what is the current state of poverty in communities of color in the U.S.?
I just want to get into a few of the numbers real quickly, because they bring it home, vividly. In 2011, African Americans had a median liquid wealth. Liquid wealth is just those financial assets that you can quickly turn into cash. Not your income, but if your car got towed, could you get some money real quick to get it out of hock? Or put something in hock, or get it out of the tow shop. Or if some tragedies, struck your car, or, something else happened that then you needed some quick cash, would you have any on hand? African Americans had a median liquid wealth of only $200 compared to $23,000 held by whites and $19,500 held by Asians. Latinos didn't fare much better than African Americans. They had a median liquid wealth of $340. So what that tells you is that the median liquid wealth of whites is over 100 times that of blacks, and more than 65 times that held by Latinos. And so when we get into a lot of discussions about affirmative action, for example, I think this report has a lot to say about economic inequality, but also about prison systems and affirmative action. When I get into affirmative action discussions a lot of times, Molly, through the years, and I look at the studies now, you see that a lot of white Americans believe that racism is a relic of a benighted but bygone era, that actually the playing field is relatively level today, and many studies show that many whites feel the dominant kind of racism today is reverse racism against whites in favor of blacks and browns and minorities. But when you look at these numbers, they're staggering. The whites have a median net worth overall of 111,740 compared to blacks having 7,113 overall. That's 15 times the median net worth of blacks. When you go through, African Americans and Latinos are over twice as likely as whites to hold no financial assets at all. That is, to be right there. If their car gets towed, they can't do anything about it. They're at that place, in staggering numbers. And so when you look at the breakdown of the racial wealth gap, you wonder how it is that so many white Americans of good faith, I believe, actually think that we live in a racially relatively fair and just society, no longer any need for affirmative action or Great Society programs or anything else along those lines. And these numbers, they quantify racism. They quantify the injustice of racism in a way that you can't avoid. You just do the math and you see it.
Well, do these numbers also present us with an avenue for how to address racism?
Yes, Molly, wow. That's where we go. That's where the authors take us next. And that's where I think their article is in many ways, and study is in many ways most powerful, but most challenging. Because what they say is, to do something about economic inequality, we're going to have to do something about redistributing wealth and power, especially wealth. And that makes people very uncomfortable. But for example, they say we got to make work pay and pay workers fairly. Raise the minimum wage, for example, they say. Do it like Seattle's doing now, $15 minimum wage. Now that's a bold kind of proposal that's going to run into a lot of difficulty, right? But it's also, if it's effectively carried out, going to lift a lot of people out of desperate poverty into a basically living wage. They also say, enact a universal baby bond trust.
That one quite took me by surprise. Can you explain what that policy is?
Yes. Now, here's what we mean. If we're talking about taking economic fairness seriously, they say this is what we should be doing. Baby bond accounts would provide an opportunity for asset development for all newborns, regardless of their family's net worth. So children born into households with the least wealth would receive a maximum amount of seed funding, they call it, from the government, estimated about $60,000. And then the federal contributions would be reduced as the net worth of the family's of the child's family increases. So we wouldn't be putting in creating these accounts for rich kids, but for poor kids, we're talking about $60,000 seed money that would take from the government. They figured out when they did the math on it, it would be a program that would cost about $80 billion to administer a year, $80 billion a year. And if you administered a program like this, you could affect a real fundamental shift in wealth gaps and in economic inequality and a lot of the ills that go from that. But do we have the will for that, Molly? Now, 80 billion might sound like a lot, but when you think about it, we were spending $12 billion a month on the Iraq War, a war we really shouldn't have been in, as history has shown, but $12 billion a month on that war. This is not nearly that much, and we could achieve from an $80 billion investment like this a real kind of not only sense of racial equality, but we would be promoting our economic well-being going into the future, is what the authors say.
You know, I think we'd make a mistake if we talked about this conversation and we didn't talk about housing. Housing is key to financial stability within families, and the study looks at housing and it says that race, ethnicity, and place are closely linked to the effects of the housing crisis. Talked about the financial crisis and how Blacks and Latinos were especially targeted with subprime mortgages that almost doomed households to failure and to foreclosure. Can you talk about that and the link there?
Oh yeah, it is. It's powerful, really, that the fact of the matter is home ownership is still the key driver of wealth, they point out. It's the key way that Americans amass wealth. It's, one of the one of the primary ways, especially among blacks and Latinos and people of color. They talk about Asian Americans too, who have less asset diversity. So they have a special amount of their asset resources lying in their property, and they noticed that Arizona, California, Florida, Michigan, and Nevada were the 5 states hit hardest by the housing crisis in 2008. So when all those houses plummeted in value, it was people in those states that suffered the most, and in those states you had a disproportionate number of Latinos and Asians, and so they took a real hit when in the 2008 housing downturn. So they point that out, but they go on to point out more generally, as you say, that since home ownership is the key driver of wealth in America, and that so many people of color, including Asian Americans and especially Latino and Black Americans, don't have access to housing or are in houses that are upside down on the more. They're underwater now because they owe more than the house is worth because of the downturn. For all those kinds of reasons, the housing industry has to be something we focus on. There was predatory lending practices rather going on by toward the Black community, Latino community especially, and so there had that. And while the government was asleep at the wheel, and so there should be some responsibility for that. So for all those kind of reasons, they say yes, the housing situation rather, is something we have to focus attention on if we want to close the racial wealth gap in America and figure out how to get more people of color, especially Black and Latinos and Asians who really lost out in the 2008 downturn, get them more home ownership and get them help in hanging on to the homes they have. And by the way, in doing so, you'll help a lot of white Americans who are suffering too. Even though they're suffering and a smaller percentage of white America is suffering, there's still a significant chunk of white America that's suffering a great deal, and they will benefit from these programs as well.
What are potential solutions, or what is the next step for fixing the housing problem after the recession?
Well, for example, the authors point out we need to ensure that mortgage relief programs are transparent and fair. We came up with all these mortgage relief programs that Congress and the administration talked about, but they need to ensure that these future mortgage settlements with banks, et cetera, include collection of racial and ethnic, gender, and geographical data in order to ensure that the relief programs are being administered fairly and are targeting the hardest hit communities. So that's one way. Allow Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to perform principal reduction and loan modifications, they say, for distressed homeowners. That community of color, since communities of color were hit hardest by the housing crisis, let's try to address that by having the Federal Housing Finance Agency should allow Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they say, to assist the distressed homeowners. So, there are those kinds of approaches that the government can take to making sure they get rid of redlining, of course, and those kinds of practices that the government the measures the government can take to make sure that there's more equity in the opportunity for home ownership across all Americans of all races and even of different income levels.